Intruder. Go to WebGoat and browse to A7 cross-site scripting. Then go to step 2. You will probably need to click on step 1 first if it's the first time you're visiting this lesson. Scroll to the bottom of the page and you'll find the text box. Fill in a value and click the Submit button. I'm going to switch to Burp and look for that request in the Proxy tab under HTTP history. This looks like it. Notice the answer _XSS_1 post parameter contains the value we entered. I'll just send this request to Intruder by using the keyboard shortcut Command+I. You can also do that from the context menu by choosing Send to Intruder. Notice that the Intruder tab is highlighted. Let's switch to it. Notice the new request that was added here, labeled as 2. The Intruder functionality allows us to execute automated requests and attacks on web applications. The Intruder functionality allows us to send HTTP requests in an automated manner and execute attacks on web applications. The first subtab contains the target configuration, such as the host and port. Note that in this case, the information was automatically filled because we sent the request from another Burp tab where the info was known. Like in other places of Burp's UI, we can rename or move tabs as we wish. The position subtab allows us to configure the attack type, which is how Burp will inject the payloads, and the payload positions in the current template request, which is where Burp will inject the payloads. The actual template request is used as a base from which the attack request will be derived. Notice the right side buttons. These allow adding and removing payload markers in the request template panel. Now, what are payload markers? Payload markers are placed using this weird character, and each pair of markers designates a single payload position. It could enclose text, and Burp will overwrite it and the marker with a payload. Intruder automatically highlights each pair of payload markers and any enclosed text between them. Note that we already have a few markers defined. When we send a request to Intruder from elsewhere within Burp, Intruder makes a guess at where we are likely to want to place payloads and sets payload markers accordingly. We can modify the default payload markers using the buttons next to the request template editor. Let's select some text and add the payload marker using the Add button. Note how Burp highlights the payload marker now. We can also use the Clear button to remove all payload markers from the request template or the selection. The Auto button makes a guess as to where it might be useful to position payloads and places payload markers accordingly. This is useful to quickly mark positions suitable for fuzzing, but manual positioning is required for more precise attacks. This also works on selections, of course. The automatic placement of markers insets payload markers into the value of various types of request parameters, including URL query string parameters, body parameters, cookies, multi-part parameter attributes like file name in file uploads, XML data, and JSON parameters. We can configure whether the automatic payload positions will replace or append to the existing parameter values via an option in the Intruder app menu. The refresh button just refreshes the syntax colorizing of the request template editor if necessary. Let's clear the cookie payload marker using the Clear button. Now let's look at Intruder's attack types. These determine the way in which payloads are assigned to payload positions. The first two attacks, Sniper and Battering Ram, use a single set of payloads, while the other two attacks use multiple payload sets. The first attack, called Sniper, targets each payload position in turn and places each payload into that position. This attack type is useful for fuzzing a number of request parameters individually for common vulnerabilities. The second one, Battering Ram, iterates through the payloads and places the same payload into all of the defined payload positions at once. This attack type is useful where an attack requires the same input to be inserted in multiple places within the request. For example, a username both within a cookie and a body parameter. The pitchfork attacks allows setting a payload set for each defined position. The attack iterates through all payload sets simultaneously and places one payload into each defined position. In other words, the first request will place the first payload from payload set 1 into position 1 and the first payload from payload set 2 into position 2. The second request will place the second payload from payload set 1 into position 1 and the second payload from payload set 2 into position 2. This attack type is useful where an attack requires different but related input to be inserted in multiple places within the request. And finally, cluster bomb. This one also places a payload set for each position similar to pitchfork. But the key difference is that this attack iterates through each payload set in turn so that all permutations of payload combinations are tested. If there are two payload positions, the attack will place the first payload from the payload set 2 into position 2 and iterate through all the payloads in payload set 1 in position 1. It will then place the second payload from payload set 2 into position 2 and iterate through all the payloads in payload set 1 in position 1. This attack type is useful where an attack requires different and unrelated or unknown input to be inserted in multiple places within the request. Note that this will result in a very large number of requests sent to the server because it's the product of the number of payloads in all defined payload sets. Let's stick with the sniper attack and switch to the payloads tab. We can configure the actual payloads here. The first combo box, called payload set, allows us to choose what payload set we want to configure. The sniper attack uses a single payload set, so we're good. The payload type combo box allows us to choose from several types of payloads from a simple provided list to auto-generated ones. We can configure additional options depending on the payload type we choose. For example, choosing numbers will allow us to configure Intruder to generate number payloads. Let's choose that one. We can now configure additional payload options. Enter a starting point and an ending point. We can also set a step and limit fraction digits to make sure Intruder generates integer numbers. For example, we can use these types of payloads to enumerate sequential resources. We can do additional payload processing using the payload processing and payload encoding sections. In the Options subtab, we can configure additional settings like number of retries and timeouts. In the Pro version, we can also configure number of threads and throttling settings. We can also configure what to do with the attack results and do additional processing and highlighting using a grep like functionality. Now let's click the Start Attack button. We get a message notifying us that the community edition of Burp throttles Intruder attacks. But we can make use of it if we have a small number of payloads to test. Clicking OK will start the attack. Burp opens a new window for the attack, in which it shows us the current progress. We can notice how requests are added to the panel as they are executed. We can choose a request and view its contents and response. We can also filter, do search queries, highlight requests, etc. Pretty much everything which you can do in every panel of Burp. We can also add more columns from Burp's application menu. And we also have the same usual interconnectivity provided by our already well-known context menu along with the specific Intruder features. And we can just tap this attack now.